The U.S. is shocked by the collapse of Ukraine. Terror seizes the Pentagon, and Bolton fears the Russians are preparing something unprecedented, he says. There is intense concern about, but also confusion in the American establishment about the conditions that have developed in the Ukrainian conflict. Typical of the concern that grips the U.S. is a statement by Democratic Senator Chris Murphy that Ukraine could return to the control of the Russian Federation. The imminent Russian victory is leading American officials to call for urgent U.S. action to prevent an end to hostilities. U.S. policymakers are already talking openly about halting an alleged Russian diplomatic offensive. In other words, simply trying to prevent an immediate end to the war. Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton expresses great concern about the future of Ukraine. According to him, Kiev could be close to defeat. And Bolton was startled. Bolton does not believe that Russia will completely destroy the Ukraine armed forces, but believes that Moscow may launch a kind of diplomatic offensive, quote unquote, to end the conflict. In other words, that peace will be reached. It claims that Russia could begin to pursue negotiations on a deal to recognize the occupied territories called illegally annexed by Westerners. And in this way, the Ukrainian leadership will know absolute defeat, as its territorial losses would be consolidated diplomatically, effectively erasing the disagreement around the issue. As a solution to such a problem, quote unquote, Bolton calls on the U.S. to try to rapidly increase aid to Ukraine, implementing all necessary measures to prevent Russia from winning the war. Urgently put pressure on Biden. In this sense, he's asking U.S. lawmakers to pressure U.S. President Joe Biden to engage in a type of strategic victory, quote unquote, with efforts for Ukraine to advance militarily and defeat Russia. The former advisor also laments the fact that the amount of military aid to Kiev is decreasing. And according to him, Ukrainians are worried about this process as it tends to weaken them on the battlefield. And as is well known, this reduction in aid is due to the increasing escalation in Israel, which has become the main focus of American foreign policy since October. Pro-Ukrainian politicians are doing everything they can to prevent the end of aid, but Washington is currently unable to maintain regular massive military support for Ukraine and Israel at the same time, Bolton says. And Bolton is out of touch, ignorant of the weaknesses of the U.S. defense industry, it appears. Bolton, however, ignores the reality of the U.S. defense industry and claims that systematic support of Kiev must remain a priority or there will be a Russian victory, which would obviously be bad for U.S. geopolitical interests. He points out in an op-ed, the authoritative geological analyst Lucas Leroy writes, ultimately, if we don't help the Ukrainians endure, eventually Russia will win. I think the people in the House of Representatives and the Senate should push Biden as hard as possible to develop a winning strategy in Ukraine, not just to prevent Ukraine from losing, but to bring about Ukraine's victory. I think the Ukrainians are worried about the possible loss of American support. I hope we will find a way to give them the additional military support they need, the Pentagon hawk noted, visibly worried about the future. He said, I'm very concerned about a Russian diplomatic offensive that is trying to win at the negotiating table. This can happen at any time, so we have to be ready for it, he said. The only logical solution is peace negotiations. The reality, of course, is very different, as Russia is simply seeking to negotiate peace on favorable terms to end hostilities soon. Moscow is seeking Kiev's agreement to negotiate an end to the violence, Leroy believes. With Russia clearly the victor on the battlefield, this negotiation should prioritize Russia's strategic and territorial interest, establishing the new territories as undisputed territories of the Russian Federation. The longer Ukrainian persistence prolongs the conflict, the more Russian diplomatic legitimacy increases in public opinion, and that is what Bolton fears. At the same time, the U.S. does not allow Kiev to negotiate, but is now divided due to the situation in the Middle East. In the midst of all of this, the hawks like Bolton have become increasingly aggressive and reactionary, calling for even absurd measures such as taking initiatives to stop all diplomatic efforts. Bolton is terribly wrong to think that there can be any other solution than to resort to forced negotiations with Russia to impose its terms. Kiev is completely incapable of reversing the military situation of the conflict. Due to its human losses, even the possible receipt of large amount of equipment and weapons, it will not be possible to achieve territorial gains. There is no chance that this winning strategy proposed by Bolton will be successful, notes Liros. American investments in aid to Ukraine have proven completely incapable of yielding positive results. Indeed, it was never the American goal to defeat Russia through Ukraine. Since Kiev is clearly much weaker militarily, the only American intention was to wear down Moscow, which also failed. At some point in the near future, American generals will have to accept this. White House says, we can't afford one Ukraine defeat. Don't give Putin a gift. The national security interests of the United States cannot afford to lose the conflict in Ukraine. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby admitted on Wednesday, December 6th, amid a lack of agreement from Congress on providing additional tens of billions of dollars to Kiev. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's top advisor said that without U.S. support, there's a big risk that Ukraine will lose this war. The Ukrainian people certainly can't afford it, Europe can't afford it, and our own national security interests cannot afford it, Kirby said during a news conference. He further warned that if Congress does not support the White House request for additional funding for Ukraine, the effect on the ability of U.S. allies to support Ukraine could be catastrophic. He said, we are the biggest supporter of Ukraine's security and other economic needs. And if we just pull the plug, the effect that could have on other countries and their ability to support Ukraine could be almost catastrophic. A real gift to Vladimir Putin, Kirby said. And Yellen, U.S. Secretary, says if Ukraine loses the war with Russia, we will be responsible. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the U.S. will be responsible for the defeat of Ukraine if Congress has not approved the Biden administration $106 billion request to fund the wars in Ukraine and Israel, among other security issues. Yellen from Mexico, where she's based, called the funding absolutely necessary and a condition for the IMF to maintain an uninterrupted flow of funds to Ukraine, according to Reuters. She said, I've talked to members of Congress, my colleagues. I think they understand that this and that we will have to hold ourselves responsible for the defeat of Ukraine if we fail to decide on the funding that's needed. And I'm including immediate fiscal support here because that's absolutely necessary, she said. Russia said we will decide with a referendum the annexation of the whole of Ukraine. The whole of Ukraine? At the same time, Moscow's assurances about the possible annexation of the whole of Ukraine to the Russian Federation are anything but reassuring for the U.S. It is the people of Ukraine who can make such a choice, as the people of Crimea and other Russian regions have expressed their will to join Russia, said Deputy Chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee Yuri Shvitkin. His comment, which upset the U.S., of course, came in response to U.S. Senator Chris Murphy's recent statement that Ukraine could return to the control of the Russian Federation. Quote, it's a shame that an American senator decides on Ukraine. They have driven Ukraine to the point of real collapse. Ukraine is essentially on the brink of an abyss. It has ceased to exist as a state, end quote, Yuri Shvitkin said, adding that Russia's primary goal is to achieve the goals of the special military operation. Ritter, ex-CIA, says Russians have exhausted the Ukrainians. There will be no pause in the operations front. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky unexpectedly cancelled his video appearance at the U.S. Senate briefing. Zelensky was expected to brief U.S. lawmakers on the latest developments in Ukraine and urged them to disperse more than $60 billion to his country. Meanwhile, Ukraine's current military package is nearly exhausted. There are also rumors in the Western press that NATO allies want Zelensky to either hold the talks or freeze the conflict along the contact line. Will the Kiev regime be forced to take a hiatus during the winter season? Well, what we won't see is a pause, Scott Ritter, former CIA analyst and former UN weapons inspector, told Sputnik. He said, right now we have a situation where the Russians are ready. These 300,000 Russian conscripts are fully trained. The majority of them have not been thrown into the battlefield. And in addition, over 450,000 volunteer and contract soldiers were absorbed. The Russians are in full force with all the equipment, all the means. There will be no pause. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have nothing to replace what is happening. And now they're literally grabbing teenagers and pregnant women and putting them on the battlefield to fill the holes in the lines. There is nothing left, and the West has run out of money. There is no equipment. The Russians are not going to press the pause button to give Ukraine a chance to catch its breath. The whole purpose of the Russian approach was to exhaust Ukrainians, and now we are there, he said. This is from Banking News. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.